Let's look at how the figure that appears in Daniel chapter 2 is confirmed in another vision in chapter 7, but no longer in the figure of a man made in 4 different materials, but now through 4 different beasts. Who are these beasts? What do they represent? Listen to this devotional. Today, let's allow the book of Daniel to lead us through the prophecies of Revelations, because we cannot do it alone, nor should we. Welcome to our devotional, Mana, where we listen to and obey the Lord's word. The 7th chapter of the book of Daniel. Please go to it, open it, get your notebook to take notes, because this chapter offers an unusual vision, which Daniel received the first year of King Belshazzar's reign in Babylon, in about the year 555 before Christ. The vision talks about great world empires and events during the time of Daniel all the way up to the second coming of Christ. The vision ends with Daniel saying in chapter 7 verse 28, "As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed me, but I kept the matter in my heart." What did Daniel see? In verse 1, remember, I'm reading Daniel 7. It says, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. And this was the same expression used in chapter 2, verse 28, speaking of the kingdom and visions that King Nebuchadnezzar had during his reign. These 2 dreams and visions in conjunction were approximately 50 years apart. But as we will see, both describe 4 world empires. The vision of the 4 beasts and the small horn that we find here in Daniel 7 reveals more information regarding the 4 empires described first in the dream of the great image in King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Let's begin verses 3 and 4. Notice that here Daniel describes 4 large beasts, all different from each other, that came up from the sea. The first one was as a lion, but had wings like an eagle. Then it says, I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. But notice that in verse 17 it tells us that those great beasts, which are 4 kings which arise out of the earth. And so the lion was a symbol of the king of Babylon, and the heart of man signified one of its most renowned kings, Nebuchadnezzar, whom is described in the first 4 chapters of this book that we are reading, the book of Daniel. The symbol of a lion was characteristic of Babylon, especially during the time of the king Nebuchadnezzar, when the entrance to the doors of the palace were adorned on both sides with a long procession of lions of yellow color and brick and blue crystal that stood out. And when it talks about the wings torn out from the lion, the eagle wings, this was a symbol of the moment when King Nebuchadnezzar lost his mind, when he was humbled by God in order for all people and living creatures to acknowledge that the Most High is who governs the kingdom of men. Do you recall in chapter 4 that we've read before, and where we see that the Lord punishes King Nebuchadnezzar, where he loses his mind and goes crazy during a period of 7 years. Nebuchadnezzar reigned from Babylon all the way to Asia Minor, and from the Caspian Sea through Egypt. Biblically, his most significant conquest was that of the nation of Judah. Do you recall when Daniel was made captive and taken to Babylon? After the death of his father, Nebuchadnezzar reigned over Babylon 43 years. And after his death, Babylon continued to be a very strong empire, up to the year 539 before Christ, when it was conquered by the second emergent power in the vision of Daniel, which was the Medo-Persian Empire. Let's go to verse 5. We're reading Daniel chapter 7. And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said to thus, Arise, devour much flesh. And to look, this beast that was raised up more on one side represented the Persians being greater than the Medes, who reigned at that time. And this makes sense because Daniel, 2 years later, when in a vision sees a calf with 2 horns, one horn is bigger than the other. The angel Gabriel says to Daniel that this calf represents the kings of Mede and of Persia. 3 ribs being devoured represent 3 kingdoms conquered by the first great king of Persia. And speaking of these kings, we're talking about Cyrus and his son. Cyrus arrived to power in the year 528 and conquered the Lydio Empire of Asia Minor. And in the year 546, he conquered the Chaldean Empire, or the Empire of Babylon. And his son conquered Egypt in the year 526 before Christ. The Mede-Persian Empire lasted 200 years, and under the kings that followed, it expanded into Persia, or Greece, on the west and India on the east. And at one point, the Persian Empire covered 3 continents partially: Asia, Africa, and Europe. But just as the Chaldean Empire, the Persian Empire came to an end, and a new beast began to emerge in the west, and its time had come. Verse 6 of Daniel 7 says, "After this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." Just as the second beast, this third one is clearly identified by Gabriel, the angel, giving this vision. This beast represented Greece, and the king was Alexander Magnus. And after an early death in the year 323 before Christ, he was barely 30 years old. His empire was divided into 4 smaller kingdoms, or empires, and this is described in Daniel chapter 8 if you like to review it. This symbol of a leopard with the 4 wings represents this ascending empire sudden, where Alexander quickly conquers the Persian Empire. And this happens in the year 334 before Christ, and after his death, which, like I mentioned, was very early. His empire was divided into 4 kingdoms, and the new kingdoms were first Greece and Macedonia. The second kingdom was Thracia and Asia Minor. The third was the Middle East, and the fourth was Egypt and Palestine. The text goes on to say, "After this I saw in night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. This beast conquered 4 kingdoms and expanded further than the lands that had been conquered by the previous beasts." Let's continue, verse 7 of chapter 7, where it describes this beast. And this 4th beast is much different than the previous described, and it says that it has 10 horns here in verse 7. But if you read verse 24 of this same Daniel 7, it says the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. Look, when the Bible talks about this resurging, it says that the 10th and last resurgence will be destroyed by Jesus Christ in his second coming, as it says in verses 26 and 27. And here is where we come in to define the 4th beast as the empire that at the end will unite into 10 nations directed and governed by the Antichrist himself. This is why yesterday, when we read in the figure being described in the image in Daniel chapter 2, that described a stone, and that this stone would break into pieces absolutely everything. And this is why I want to discuss this, because when we reach Revelations and speak about the Antichrist, do not forget this reference that we're making here, because Daniel, with great anticipation, was prophesying the kingdoms that were going to reign the earth. And if you ask any historian, they will be able to talk about these kingdoms that have reigned on earth. But the time will come when this 4th kingdom will emerge, almost as a community of nations that are very powerful, giving the Antichrist all power to govern globally over all. This is why the study of prophecy is so interesting, because it is joined with politics, economies, and technology. In the measure that time goes on, it is more possible that the biblical prophecies be fulfilled. And why? 50 or 100 years ago, to speak about a global economy was nearly impossible. But today we talk about global economies. And we're heading towards a future where cash or physical money will no longer be available. And entire economies will be centralized, where everything will be controlled and managed and everyone tracked. And so to speak of a chip, for example, as described in 666 of Revelations, today is quite normal. And it's said that this is how people will be controlled and Christians will be persecuted. And this is how those in the population on earth will not be able to buy or sell and persecuted. And so again, to speak of a global economy years ago was impossible. Today, the multilateral organizations influence to name people that will represent many nations and peoples. So each day, this becomes stronger. Daniel 7:8 says, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there, in the horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. This small horn represents this, a powerful system, a religious system that will align with the other 7 horns, political horns out of the 10, that would surge after the fall of Rome. And this alliance between the religious system and state, as a result, an empire rises that is very powerful. Look at verse 21, 22, and 25 of this chapter 7 of Daniel, where the small horn wages war against the holy, blaspheming against God, attempts to change the times and the law, persecuting the saints of the Most High for a time and times and half a time. In other words, 3.5 years. And this is the period we're going to talk about next week as we enter the topic of the 70 weeks of Daniel. And I think tomorrow we can begin after speaking of the image of Daniel 2 and the beasts in chapter 7. We can start chapter 9 that talks about the prophecies of the 70 weeks. So the evidence of this persecution is evident through the centuries, that while hundreds and thousands of people have lost their lives through all types of inquisitions through the judicial system. For example, look at the time of the Crusades. How many people died? How many were executed for diverging and not submitting to the authorities of the doctrines of certain churches? And all of this was abolished, the Inquisitions. But the Bible indicates that the religious persecutions on behalf of the small horn would resurge, and as a result, many deaths would follow before the second coming of Christ. And Daniel sees the conclusion regarding the end of the small horn, which is when Christ returns, when the Bible tells us that the judge will sit and take its dominion, destroying it to the end. And so this vision, Daniel's vision, ends with great news here in verse 27, where it says, Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall save and obey him. And so this prophecy goes on to reveal that Jesus Christ will establish his dominion here on earth, given to the saints of the Most High. And what is the biblical definition of a saint? Well, I've mentioned to you before, he who through the work of Christ has been set apart, chosen by him for his eternal purpose. And so do not miss out on what's coming up regarding Daniel's prophecies, because they're very interesting and they will allow us to better understand what the end of time means. Pray with me. Father, your eternal purposes have been fulfilled throughout time. And the Bible says, for those who are understanding and sensible and by heart, and to the voice of the Lord, your plans will never be unknown to those, but the complete opposite. You will let us know your plans through your Holy Spirit. Thank you for each listener of Mana. I pray for this time, for this day. Guard us in all that we will do and begin. Guard our life, our health, our family. Thank you for being with us and for sustaining us. We commend ourselves to you, and we ask for your blessing, and I'll wait for you tomorrow in our next devotional time when we will speak about the 70 weeks of Daniel's prophecy. Blessings to all.